At first glance, nothing about a morning in Bogotá seems unusual. A courier scans a barcoded package before placing it on the back of his motorcycle. An elevator in a mid-rise hums as it resets to the ground floor after the last resident leaves for work. A building superintendent performs his routine check of the water pump that feeds the upper tanks. These motions feel ordinary, almost forgettably so. The daily choreography of a city that has grown used to vertical living and constant construction. Most residents never wonder why new high-rises keep appearing in the same clusters, or why building permits in some districts move faster than others, or why certain developers seem to face fewer procedural delays during environmental reviews. They assume it's demand, or policy, or luck. What rarely crosses anyone's mind is the subtle architecture beneath these conveniences, the lattice of approvals, certifications, and compatibility checks that determines which projects proceed and which evaporate before breaking ground. A resident might believe that the steady rise of new towers is a sign of growth, or investor confidence, or efficient governance. But the quiet truth is simpler and more obscure. Each new project follows a pathway shaped long before construction begins, a pathway defined not by politics or capital, but by a set of procedural gateways few ever see. The city feels open, accessible, expanding by its own momentum. Yet the smoothness of that expansion, the predictability of where cranes appear and where they never will, hints at a layer of coordination that is neither dramatic nor hidden, simply upstream from public attention. The elevator doors open, the courier rides off, the superintendent signs his checklist. Everything works the way it is supposed to, and it does so because someone, somewhere, ensured that it could. We are taught to locate influence in the places easiest to watch. The mayor's announcements about zoning reforms, the developers featured in financial newspapers, the investment funds whose names appear on construction banners wrapped around unfinished facades. These are the figures most residents understand as the drivers of urban growth, the ones who appear at ribbon-cutting ceremonies or give interviews about revitalization strategies and economic confidence. Yet their authority, while real, operates at the surface level, the level of messaging, negotiation, and public visibility. The machinery beneath them is older, quieter, and far more decisive. Zoning boards follow templates inherited from decades of regulatory layering. Environmental assessments depend on compatibility matrices produced by consultancy groups no voter has heard of. Loan guarantees for new towers require compliance with technical standards drafted far from the public eye. Politicians may set priorities, and corporations may finance ambition, but neither defines the underlying structure that makes those ambitions viable. When a developer announces a new project, what they are really announcing is permission. Permission that only exists because an array of technical intermediaries has validated the project's alignment with frameworks the public never encounters directly. In this sense, the visible actors manage expectations, risks, and narratives, while the deeper mechanisms shape the boundaries of what is possible. It isn't deception, it is division of labor. But the result is that the places where power is most recognized are rarely the places where decisions begin. The skyline rises, the public debates density and affordability, and officials cite policy goals, all while the invisible scaffolding beneath them continues to determine which towers can exist at all, and which ones never make it past the first sketch on a developer's desk. The origins of the Calderón Consortium trace back not to wealth or political ambition, but to a logistical bottleneck in Bogotá's mid-century expansion. In the late 1970s, as the city began tightening requirements for seismic compliance in new residential towers, a small engineering office run by an unassuming structural analyst named Mateo Calderón secured a modest contract to standardize the reporting format for load distribution tests submitted by independent builders. It was not design work, not oversight, not even certification, just the formatting of data, ensuring that municipalities received comparable documentation during a period when construction methods varied widely. Yet the position offered a kind of vantage point others overlooked. Calderón's office, by handling the translation of technical tests into regulatory language, became the first layer through which new projects quietly passed. They never advised authorities on what to approve, but they shaped how information arrived, how it was categorized, how it matched pre-existing templates. And from the beginning, the family adhered to a principle that would define their imprint for decades. Never appear on the executive or political side of decisions. They avoided direct ownership of construction firms, avoided partnerships that might bring public attention, avoided any role that required their name to be printed on permits or plaques. Instead, they focused on occupying the scene between engineering practice and administrative interpretation. Over time, their office grew into a node, small, technical, and forgettable, embedded in the machinery that determined whether a proposed tower was procedurally legible. Their influence did not stem from authority, but from access. access to the formatting rules that made infrastructure speak in a language regulators recognized. They never set the standards. They made the standards easier to adopt. And that simplicity, quiet, procedural, uncelebrated, became their foothold in a system that would eventually expand far beyond any individual or generation. What followed was not growth in the conventional sense, but a gradual thickening of presence, each layer added through contracts that looked too minor to matter. A subsidiary of the Calderón office began offering a uniform template for soil density reporting, which several municipalities quietly adopted because it reduced audit times. Another branch provided a calibration library for vibration dampening materials used in high-rise cores. Developers used it because their insurers preferred documentation aligned with recognized coefficients. Over the years, these tools, forms, matrices, compatibility lists, slipped into regional procurement packages, not by force, but by convenience, until compliance with Calderón-style documentation became the path of least resistance. Nothing about the expansion was dramatic. No acquisitions, no architectural firms bought out, no public-facing entities tying projects to a single name. Instead, the influence spread through the dry mechanics of how information moved. Who verified a geological test? Which telemetry format an elevator system had to report in? Which seismic simulation engine was considered trustworthy for loan underwriting by international development banks? By the early 2000s, a lattice of entities, some commercial, some advisory, some nominally independent, provided the procedural backbone for tower development across several Andean regions. Their work was unglamorous, drafting interoperability guidelines, servicing compliance software, maintaining version histories for structural reporting templates. But these were the steps every major project had to pass through, and stepping outside them introduced delays few developers could afford. The Calderón network didn't wield power through visibility. It accumulated inertia, the quiet expectation that documents should look a certain way, that models should rely on familiar parameters, that audits should align with precedents set years earlier. Influence became indistinguishable from routine, embedded not in decisions, but in the assumptions that made decisions seem straightforward. The turning point came not through conspiracy or ambition, but through the structural turbulence of the early 2000s, when Bogotá confronted simultaneous pressures that exposed the fragility of its development pipeline. A regional earthquake forced a reevaluation of seismic tolerances. A national financing reform altered how risk was distributed across lenders, and a wave of foreign capital, chasing yield in emerging markets, accelerated timelines for high-rise approvals beyond what municipal systems were built to handle. Public institutions reacted as institutions often do, slowly, methodically, constrained by procedure and consensus. Committees formed, temporary frameworks were drafted, but the demand for new towers moved faster than the bureaucracy meant to regulate them, and developers began depending on pre-standardized documentation kits just to keep projects viable. The Calderón-aligned entities, already woven into the certification and reporting layers, didn't need to pivot. Their frameworks were simply the ones ready for immediate deployment. A municipality overwhelmed by permit requests adopted their seismic reporting protocol because it reduced administrative load. A major lender began accepting their soil risk matrices as default because alternative formats required manual review. Even environmental assessments, under pressure from new global compliance requirements, leaned on their compatibility tables, which happened to be the only ones already harmonized with emerging international guidelines. Nothing about this shift was intentional. It was contingency filtered through preparedness. As institutions scrambled to adapt to new risks and new investors, the Calderón architecture provided the smoothest procedural path, not because it was superior, but because it was already interoperable. And once their documentation became the backbone of crisis-driven workflows, it stayed there. Developers grew accustomed to it. Auditors built processes around it. Insurers indexed their models to it. The crisis passed, the skyline changed, and most people forgot the moment entirely. But the structures that survived did so because they required no reinvention, only continuity. In the years that followed, the presence of the Calderón family receded almost completely from the processes their predecessors once shaped. Directorships passed to holding companies with rotational trustees. Technical committees were staffed by consultants whose connection to the original lineage existed only as inherited methodology, and the old engineering office dissolved into a network of licensing bodies, data custodians, and compliance cooperatives that no longer needed a surname to function. What remained was not a dynasty, but an architecture, a self-updating web of procedural obligations, interoperability standards, escrow conditions, and certification schemas scattered across multiple jurisdictions. A small trust in Toronto held archival rights to pre-reform seismic simulations used for legacy towers. A nonprofit in Santiago maintained the algorithmic checks for elevator telemetry compliance. An advisory group in Zurich routinely updated soil risk coefficients that Andean lenders treated as reference points. None of these entities declared alignment. None were coordinated by a central authority. Their cohesion emerged from shared compatibility requirements, a slow accretion of inherited logic that made deviation costly and adherence efficient. The human element faded, not hidden, but rendered irrelevant by the stability of the framework itself. Developers no longer knew who created the reporting formats they relied on. Regulators worked from templates whose authorship had long been abstracted into technical committees. Even legal teams drafting cross-border financing agreements cited clauses whose origins predated their own organizations. Influence no longer belonged to any identifiable actor. It lived in the defaults, the document structures no one rewrote, the parameters no one challenged, the compliance pathways no one had reason to replace. In disappearing from view, the Calderón presence did not weaken. It became structural, a procedural terrain that continued to regulate the shape of Bogotá's skyline long after the family had ceased to exist as anything more than a faint archival reference.